Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here, and it is time once again for another blind amplifier shootout, but with a twist. Instead of hearing how this gear sounds different in the same application, I'm going to intentionally attempt to make them sound identical, at least to the best of my abilities. And this will essentially be kind of an extension of a video I made a couple years ago talking about the importance of both pre-distortion and post-distortion EQ for amplifiers. So those of you that are already familiar with this topic, you might see where I'm going with this. But for those that aren't, when we talk about tone matching, whether we're talking about a mixing and production point of view, or you have an amp modeler where you can download custom presets, generally people will build out a signal chain that looks like the guitarist that they're trying to imitate. So maybe they'll use the same drive pedal, the same amplifier model, similar cabinet impulse response, throw on all the effects, but then something like an Axe Effects has an EQ match block that you can compare to a track, and then it will change some sliders for you, and ta-da, the end result sounds pretty similar. But all of that assumes that you have those elements that are already kind of the same. What I'm going to do today is attempt to make different gear sound almost identical in a high gain scenario using both pre and post distortion equalization. So here's how this is going to work. I'm going to first record a source amplifier tone straight through the amp kind of sound, going right through a load box into my audio interface, load up a mix of impulse responses that I like, and call it a day. No other pedals, no other outboard gear. This is what this amplifier is capable of on its own. And this won't be like a perfectly mixed ready sound or anything like that. I'm just trying to get kind of a cool, dark, low mid focus, down-tuned guitar thing going on. And in that way, it's actually going to be a little harder to match, I think. But we'll take that as our reference and then record all the other gear. And we'll take that output frequency response and using Voxengo Curve EQ, apply a 60-point EQ match to the other amplifiers or gear that we're using. So same deal, straight through the amp or straight through whatever gear is being showcased, and no other outboard gear, no other pedals to manipulate the sound. We're simply going to try to match the way the source amp sits in the mix, per se. So again, for those of you that kind of have an idea of where this video is going, will know this is merely one part of the equation, but let's talk about that after the shootout here. These are already fairly compelling results across our collection of 5 guinea pig amplifiers, and as you can see from the EQ match profile, some of them definitely needed more work than others, but with the press of a couple buttons in this EQ magic software, it does everything for you, so we don't have to spend time dialing it in by ear. But a couple of these candidates, you pretty much could have done that. I mean, they only required a few high and low shelves and maybe a peaking filter in the mids to make it sound like the source amp. And that's something you could do with a parametric EQ and, of course, tweak by ear if you want a couple different changes. But that goes to show the power of an impulse response or a mic'd cabinet in general. When people think of different amplifier tones, a lot of the times the differences they think of have as much to do, if not more to do, with the speaker cab and the speaker used in that cabinet. And we've shown that plenty of times throughout this channel, but this one really proves it here. Although this only covers one aspect of the amplifier sound. So as you can hear, they all sort of sit in the mix, if they were in a mix, the same way, the same kind of boomy low end. There's really aggressive low mids, kind of a roll off on the high end. But the character of all these amplifiers is still quite different. So what's going on there? As many of you already know, EQ matching is not some magical fix-all. I could match the output frequency response of a Fender Twin to an Ingle Savage, but that doesn't magically turn it into a chuggy high-gain beast. And that's exactly what's going on here, because matching in post only affects the output, not what's going on in the gain structure. So you can still hear some of these amplifiers sound flubby or low gain compared to our source, which by comparison is quite high gain, has a lot of high mids and treble content pre-gain stage to make it chug, and has some nice resonating palm mutes. And for amplifiers that don't do that naturally, you could get a pedal like the Grind or, a Super Overdrive or a Tube Screamer or all the modern equivalents thereof. But instead, you can do something that I find to be far more versatile and just as effective in terms of a recording tool, and use something like a graphic equalizer. Gain structures and distortion characteristics are topics that on their own are already hard enough to talk about. I would say that's one of the more convoluted areas of discussion in my pedal head videos, since most of the time, if we're comparing like similar drive pedals, I usually have to break out waveform pictures and, schematics and show why moving a resistor here or changing a capacitor there or changing the position of diodes from this part of the circuit to this part of the circuit can make for some big sonic differences, even if the schematics don't look all that different at first glance. And this only gets more complicated when we talk about amplifiers. There is no magic plugin that can listen to one amp and then another amp and figure out those differences in filtering and clipping and distortion characteristics and just shove this magic profile between your guitar and amplifier. It doesn't work that way. The only way you could sort of do this analytically is if you had an oscilloscope and you opened up an amp and knew what to look for in the first place, and you could kind of match, okay, what's going on here versus this amplifier? How is this frequency getting attenuated? And then maybe you can make up for it. But with all that said, basically the only way to do this practically is to do it by ear. So that's exactly what I'm going to attempt in the next segment. Compared to our source amplifier, some of these amps I can hear are bright enough on the pick attack, or they've got enough bass in this part but not here. And so generally I'm going to boost all these amps with an EQ curve that looks something like this, where we roll off on all those low rumble frequencies to tighten up the chug and to give more space between a lot of those single picked notes, and then also kind of tame the high end. Some of them won't require nearly as much of that as others, but we're kind of mimicking the Tube Screamer profile for a lot of this. And the results will be better for some than others as usual, but if I do say so myself, I'm pretty impressed with the outcome on this. Aside from one candidate there that sort of sticks out like a sore thumb for reasons that should become obvious as this video concludes, I would call all of that effectively identical, right? I mean, as a guitar player, I could go through this and nitpick some of those minor differences, like perhaps this amp sounds a little thinner on those low-end palm mutes compared to our source material, or this one's more full in the chords and individually picked notes, and that's nice to hear. But from a mixing or guitar producing standpoint, who cares? Like, all of this sounds more or less the same. It's going to EQ the same. It's going to react to multiband compression more or less the same. And by the time you do all that, we get rid of even more of the differences from this source material. Yes, as a guitar player, I want to hear something and feel something that reacts nicely when I'm tracking or when I'm playing, out loud especially. But if we're strictly talking about producing guitars and recording material, and that's what a lot of this content revolves around, there's no defensible point, in my opinion, of using one of these pieces of gear versus something that perhaps costs a little less, if you know what you're doing. Of course, you still have to have a good source to match to, or kind of know the tricks in the book, shall we say, that I'm kind of employing here. But overall, I think the margin of error is a lot bigger than a lot of people want to admit when it comes to getting a good high gain guitar tone. And I even think that when it comes to cleans and crunch amps, edge of breakup stuff, you have some more room for error in some cases. Your mileage will definitely vary as you start to deviate from the source material you're trying to match. And that's why one of these candidates failed spectacularly. But, for something that's kind of close, you can sit there and both, in front of the amp and behind the amp, whether it be in an effects loop or in post-processing software, you can kind of take like a graphic EQ or even a parametric EQ and listen, how's this frequency breaking up? Is it kind of a cocked wah sound I'm going after? Or are we trying to tank this? And as you do this more and more, you'll kind of get a grip with what each amplifier needs and ultimately what you like to hear. So with all that said, let's go through the big reveal and show what each amplifier or piece of gear was. Not too shabby if I do say so myself. I don't think it's much of a surprise that, these high gain tube heads and the Mercurial software, which is great quality, already sounds mostly the same to the Mark IV. It's kind of how I would dial them in anyway, besides that big chunk out of 750 hertz. So this is kind of in my home base when it comes to high gain tones. Not a huge shock to me. I was pleasantly surprised with the original pod, which I did downgrade from 2.3 firmware to limit myself some more. And after some post EQ and a little bit of boosting, it sounds awesome. I would use that, no problem, especially a demo, but probably even an album if I had to, which goes to show that on a lot of old modeling hardware, It's the onboard cabs and the lack of input filtering, whether it be drive modeling or whatever, that limits these things. The amp modeling, though not nearly as sophisticated as newer stuff, isn't as bad as some people would make it out to be, especially for a produced track, since it already kind of has some baked-in compression and stuff that may not feel great to play through, but it works for this. And so I think a lot of people are going to get that one wrong, and I hope it's a lot of the crowd that says, oh, I can always tell when it's an amp modeler, because no, you can't. And this goes to show that. The biggest disappointment, although I definitely didn't have high hopes for it to begin with, was the Marshall MS2. And this is kind of just going to show that, you know, there's only a certain window that this can apply to. Yes, we can probably make an Engel Fireball sound mostly like a 5150. We can probably take that 5150 and work backwards and make it sound more like a JCM 800. But if you're getting into PV Rage territory, or especially a little novelty micro amp, yeah, you're going to have to do a little bit more work, because this amplifier couldn't even handle, you know, anything past here on the level before it completely gated and kind of fuzzed out on us. So I guess didn't really learn a whole lot new personally, but what I do hope that people take away is that a lot of these amp designs can definitely be made to sound very similar to one another once you understand the differences. You can compensate for them, but you better have something that's within, you know, the same tier of quality, shall we say, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be reflected in the price point, just that, you know, you're not going to be able to take one of those novelty amplifiers and tone match it to a rectifier stack. It's just not going to happen. But if you have something, whether it be modeling or plug-in related, or even something in a budget amplifier head format, you probably have a lot more options at your fingertips than you even realize. And so an amp upgrade for the guitar producer is probably not needed in a lot of scenarios. However, if you don't want to nerd out to this kind of stuff like I just did, or you need instantaneous access to multiple sounds, and that's where stuff like multi-channel amplifiers or pedal boards or amp modelers, or even some of the great freeware we look at sometimes. So, you know, there's a reason that not every studio producer is going to have one amplifier for high gain, one amplifier for mid gain, one for crunch, one for clean, and then, you know, do all this nonsense to try to get them to sound like something else based on the client's needs. It's just insane. But if you are on a budget, or you want to cover a song or a band that maybe is a little bit outside of what your gear sounds like normally, but not so far that you can't tweak it, then you've probably got room for just that. Anyway, any other questions and comments, please leave them down below. As always, thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one. Bye.